My name is Al Tillery, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy here at Northwestern. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Antiracism and Thought and Action lecture series. I want to thank my colleagues, Stephanie Hicks and Stephen Adams, for allowing the CSDD to partner with the Change Makers Committee to produce the series. I also want to thank the NU Human Resources Department for providing financial support to run the series. It's our great pleasure today to welcome two of the nation's leading scholars of gender and race, and also two of my colleagues and friends to share their wisdom with us on the panel today. As I've said repeatedly in this series, I could easily spend the entire hour doing introductions of these two extraordinary scholars, but since this is a power hour, you're gonna have to forgive me. We're gonna do the short form on their introductions, but there's plenty of information on them on the web, and their writings are widely distributed on the web, and I would encourage you all to follow up and learn more about these two dynamic and wonderful thinkers. First, Nadia Brown is a university faculty scholar and an associate professor of political science and African American Studies at Purdue University. Her research focuses on Black women's studies, identity politics, and legislative studies. She's the author of Sisters in the State House, Black Women and Legislative Decision Making, a few other books, and many, many journal articles. We also are fortunate to have Mirya Holman, who's an associate professor of political science at Tulane University. Her research interests focus on women in politics, urban politics, and environmentalism. She's the author of Women in Politics in the American City and more research articles than I would like to count. Thank you both for joining us. We're so excited to have this discussion today about Black feminism, white feminism, and anti-racism. What I love about your work is that you're two scholars that try to bring the concept of feminism into active life in politics and social life. So we're going to turn it over first to Dr. Holman, to Dr. Brown, who is going to lead us through some remarks, and then we will shift to Dr. Holman and then open it up to Q&A. So Nadia, do you want to get us started?
Hey, yes. Thank you, Al, and everyone who are joining us during this Power Hour. I'm going to start today's talk, with my anger towards how we teach and think about Black feminism and then its implications for anti-racism work, and using it through the lens of a political scientist. And most of my passion comes from kind of how I think we've gotten things wrong and how I would like for us to try to think about things differently to get them right. So how did I come to Black feminism as doing anti-racist work? So I grew up in a family, so this is a long story, right? Like I grew up in a family where my brother and I are 11 months apart. And so we grew up basically like twins until we hit puberty. And then he was, treated like the second coming of Christ because he was a boy, and I was treated like I was going to do all of the work in the household, gendered work, because I was a girl. And this continued throughout throughout the rest of our adolescent lives. We go to Howard University together, and it comes very clear and evident that there are just different ways that my family expects him to interact and ways that I'm supposed to interact as a woman, and as a Black woman, as a Black man. And in our family, there was always attention paid to racial equality. I remember as a young girl, my grandfather would sit my brother and I down and talk to us about fleeing the South, leaving Jim Crow and violence, and moving to the North, settling in New York and then later in New Jersey, and the role that race and racism played in kind of animating our family story around the Great Migration was really paramount. So I enrolled in Howard University. My brother and I enrolled in Howard University. At the bottom, there's a picture of my brother and sister and I 2 years ago. So you can kind of get a visual of like what's happening here. But anyway, at Howard University, my freshman year, a professor made a comment about rape that still sticks out of my mind. He shared that rape was an assault on Black masculinity because Black men could not protect their women. And I remember being 19 years old and saying, something's wrong about this. I just don't have the words or the tools to really understand what was happening. But really, what was coming together was the recognition of these gender norms in my family and saying that women should have equal role and voice in the decisions that were happening in politics and in the world. And then really pushing back against this very masculinist narrative that was being put forth in these nationalistic spaces. And so this all kind of comes together in a culmination of me becoming a Black feminist, right? Someone who is deeply committed to the liberation of Black folks and particularly Black women and femmes and femme-identified folks, right? Recognizing that there are these great power inequities, and to just fight for racial equality or gender equality is not going to fly. So this comes together in the work that I do, and I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end. But I first start researching in the Maryland State Legislature. This is the bottom picture to the right of my book, Sisters in the State House, and where the Black women are saying we have to get things done, right? No one else is going to do the kind of work that we do because we have a different perspective. We come to the legislative table with our full identities. That's our gender, it's our generation, it's our sexual orientation, it's our nativity, and all of these things animate the politics that we put forth. And they were drastically different than what Black men and white women, white men, Asian American women and men were putting forth, and was really rooted in this Black feminist ethos that I had seen growing up in my life, but didn't have a word for it, primarily because a lot of Black women don't consider themselves feminists, right? And see feminism as something that is antithetical to a race-based struggle. Fast forward a couple of more years, and I see this happening on the ground in really innate ways in the Black Lives Matter protests in St. Louis, Missouri. I was an assistant professor at St. Louis University at the time, and was engaged in several acts of civil disobedience in Ferguson, Missouri, and also in St. Louis. And what I saw were Black women who were showing up to do this work, to do this protesting work, but in particular, there was an absence of Black male leadership, right? And so we didn't see Lacey Clay, the sitting member of Congress, come to Ferguson. Emmanuel Cleaver, who was representing the other side of Missouri in Kansas City, would come a couple of days later, right? And what comes out of this vacuum are women like Cori Bush, right, who was saying, where are the leaders, right? We're here in the streets, we're demanding that our politicians hear our pain and do something about this. And fast forward a couple of years, Cori Bush has unseated Lacey Clay and is now a member of House Representatives from Missouri. And so what this means to me, or what this kind of the culmination, is that Black feminism is a liberatory politics. And it's not just from a singleized view that it's either a race or gender, sexual orientation, nativity, immigration status, but that it's about liberation for all people. And so what I want to do, or kind of help us to think through, are these key kind of ideologies. So first, it's Black feminism is not static, it's not linear, and it can't be confined. I want to push back from these, I think, really simplistic metaphors of thinking about feminisms in waves. And this is what we tend to teach students in introduction to women's and gender studies courses, and that there's distinct time periods in the United States where we see feminism in action, but we really talk about women of color and queer folks towards the end. I'm like, nah, we've been here the whole time, right? Don't tack us on in the 1960s and 70s, but let's walk back and see how Black women have been active in pushing Black feminism, even when our revisionist history has forgotten them. It's not pretty, y'all, right? There are going to be disagreements over politics, how we're calling, how we're naming ourselves and others. There will be different intentions to people that are placed at different economic strata and margins. And then who belongs, right? Who gets to say that they're a Black feminist and who doesn't see themselves falling into this mantra? Next, I have to be real that Black feminism and intersectionality studies have been really codified and commodified in the academy and also in social movements, right? And we particularly see this happening in women's studies programs, as well as like diversity, equity, and inclusion committees and work in the academy that try to extract Black women's labor and their identities without actually showing up to kind of discuss some of the ways that systematic hierarchies marginalize Black folks and Black women in particular. What Black feminisms always do is they push social boundaries, right? If you center the folks at the margins, you have a much fuller and holistic picture of what's happening. And you can't be a Black feminist if you're not thinking about the least of these. And then lastly, it's messy. It's messy, 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 but it's a mess worth making, right? This is a title from a 2006 article from Wendy Smooth, who notes that, yeah, we have to get at the margins, right? We have to think about who is being hurt and helped. How are there multiple oppressions and privileges within the same dynamisms? In order to do so, we can't look at things neatly through like a binary 0-1, right? Are you privileged or not privileged? But it flows, it's messy, and we have to get in here and do the messiness. So quickly, kind of want to run you through a greatest hits, perhaps, of Black feminists to kind of get back to this larger point that I have, or my push that I want to do is get folks not to think about Black feminisms in waves, but to think about, you know, we've been here. We started this, right? Black women have been at pushing anti-racist work, have been pushing anti-patriarchy, and particularly white heteropatriarchy since day one. So this first picture here is of Maria Stewart. She was the first woman of any race, right? First woman of any race to give US public lectures, right? And she started doing this within 1831 to 1833. She gave 4 lectures in which she argued that God enabled Black women leaders to resist oppression. This middle picture is of Sojourner Truth, which you probably famously know about in her 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman?, in which she challenges both racial and gender inferiority from her own lived experiences. This next picture is of Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote perhaps the first Black feminist text, A Voice from the South, by a Black woman of the South, in which she called for social uplift for Black women through their own self-determination. And what that was is, remember, like thinking about her in this time period of Reconstruction, it's giving Black women education, looking to their moral standards and spiritual progress as a way to improve the standing for all Blacks. Ida B. Wells, one of my favorites, and from where y'all are in Chicago, who challenges both white suffragists, right, to form the Alpha Suffrage Club, one of the premier Black suffrage organizations, and also Black racial leaders, right? So really publicly going head to head with W.E.B. Du Bois and asking for Black women's spots at the table. Then we have Mary Church Terrell, who is one of the leaders of the Black Women's Club movement, who was trying to join women together, Black women together, after they have been pushed aside from white women's organizations and are also marginalized in Black male organizations, to figure out the ways that Black women can use their tools, their talents, and their skill set to advance the race. So moving beyond the so-called third wave, I want us to center folks that we often don't give the flowers to, right? And so Pauli Murray in 1965 coins the term Jane Crow to compare the comparisons of laws that affected Black women. So that Jim Crow laws in some ways, right, were just inadequate to understand the experiences that Black women went through. She later goes on to found NOW. She's someone who does not necessarily identify as a lesbian, but if she were alive today, most historians think that she would be trans or non-binary. So this is centered, right, and her identity is centered in all the work that she does. Actually, it's her that gives the kind of legal strategy to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So earlier this year, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, earlier this academic year, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, and there was so much fanfare about her brilliance of trying to extrapolate some of the race-based strategies that Thurgood Marshall used. She actually learned it from Pauli Murray, right? But we don't give our flowers to her. Then moving to the Combahee River Collective, who forms in 1977 to write the statement. They talk about the splits between Black feminism, Black feminists, and Black feminists within other movements, particularly Black liberatory movements and women liberatory movements. And what they do, right, in the statement is they center their identities as Black queer women or women that have love for other women in ways that move them to go away from the National Black Feminist Organization by particularly accentuating economic differences as well. This next book is of Joan Morgan's I don't have the title in front of me. Sorry, I have my picture here. When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. And for me, this was one of those books that I read as an undergrad that was like, I get it, right? Someone else was here is talking about feminism in ways that make sense to me, which gave me the tools to say that I could be, call myself a feminist. And it's hip hop feminists like Morgan who move away from these overly restrictive binaries, right? Such as you either are victimized or you're an oppressor, right? To think about what are these multiple levels in which people operate in their day-to-day lives. And for Morgan, right, she says that feminism has to be brave enough to fuck with the grays, right? So all these gray areas that happen within these binaries are what we need to talk about. This kind of feminism is sex positive, it's inclusive, it's theoretical and it's practical, and it draws on a particular analysis within hip hop culture. And then Black queer feminism, this work by Charlene Carruthers, is one that pays attention to the intersections of racism, sexism, and heterosexism to operate both within activist communities and that animate academic spaces as well, right? And so the importance of always bringing in this byline of how does anti-phobia, anti-homophobic rhetoric, or anti-heterosexist action is a necessary component of Black feminism. And then this last book is a recent work by Jennifer Nash, which asks Black women to rethink their kind of connections to intersectionality as a Black feminist home truth. And what do we get when we give up kind of this ownership, this visceral ownership of Black feminist intersectionality, and move back to some of the origins of what Black feminism has called us all to be. So why do this? What's learned when we center Black feminism in anti-racism work? Well, first, Black feminism always critiques the power structure, right? We ask what enables privilege and or marginalization. We don't just look to those that are at power, but you have to check for your own, right? And examine all the things and causes and the intersections that causes marginalizations and privilege. And where does that meet for you? So it's more than just sometimes saying, oh, I know this person or I know this institution, these are good things, but let's really complicate, again, where the privilege of marginalization meets within structures, but also within your lived self. Next, there's joy in this work. It's not about all the slow singing and flower bringing, right? Black feminism is an open room for opportunities to express one's full self, to build bridges with others, and to radically teach others self-love, right? So I think I do this in my new work with Daniel Lemmy's Sister Style, talk about how Black women's expression of self through their hairstyles, and hair texture is a way that they are showing joy in a space which was not meant for Black women political elites. Or even thinking last week when Lil Nas X dropped his latest video, right? There's joy in a Black queer identity, right? And being unabashedly who you are. We see that in Amanda Gorham's poems and Cardi B's articulation of sex positivity. Next, right, there is work to be done and Black women do it. So think about Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, and even those that contribute to my own research show that Black women show up and show out to do the work through this Black feminist ethos that many don't want to do or can't see doing because of their own privilege and sometimes over-reliance on marginalization without thinking about the ways that marginalization might prioritize them in ways that can help others. Movements need Black women, all right? Black feminist ethos remind folks of the margins. We talk about more than just say her name, but how are we showing up for trans women of color, particularly Black trans women who are being killed and are not seeing the same type, and usually being killed by Black men, right? And not seeing the same type of advocacy around their killings. Black women's movements remind people of a holistic vision of justice, right? So we're thinking about environmental justice and economic justice as being things that are tied to racial justice, not just seen as trying to help the environment for the environment's sake, but how do people living at the margins deal with environmental inequities? And then lastly, I think that Black women writers have long imagined a day without systematic oppression. So we can turn to the work of Toni Cade Bambara, Gloria Naylor, or Toni Morrison to figure out what these liberatory models might look like. So it's not just reading for humanity's sake, but these authors have given us a roadmap to think about how you can center Black women's experiences and their lived realities as a way that creates a future for moving forward. So for that, I'll stop and I'll open it up to Mirya's comments.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was great. And I've got to have that slide deck at some point. That's fantastic. Beautiful imagery. All right, Dr. Holman, we'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. That was fantastic as usual. Also, I just want to note that I have Nadia's book here, and I would highly recommend that you run out right now and buy it from your local independent bookstore. That's is my Vanna White interpretation for the day. All right, so I'm going to talk about white feminism and what I think that we can gain from white feminism in thinking about our options for liberation and how we might think about white feminism as a tool for anti-racist work. So there's sort of three pieces of feminism that I draw on to help me think about my personal role in the world and the tools that I have for changing the world for the better, and what my sort of goals might be for that change. So the first major component is that feminism can help us think about who has access to power, and then think about how to change that idea of who has access to power. Then feminism can help us think about what power is, and then how to change how we think about what power is. And then feminism can help us think about why there is an unequal distribution of power, and then change who has access to power. So the first sort of question is, who has access to power? And I think it's pretty clear if we look around the world that the access to power is not evenly distributed, and that white heterosexual men with money have most of the power in the world. And part of why I think that it's this system is allowed to continue so much is that we collectively have bought into the idea of power as being a finite resource. And so here I'm going to ask for you to just think for a minute about a crowded table. And this is the High Women. They came out with a song early on last year, a seat at the crowded table. And as a white lady that likes country music and alt rock, I really liked this song. But I think that the analogy here is really powerful. So I want you to think about post-COVID, everybody's vaccinated. We're back to being able to interact with the people that we love and care about. And you have a dinner party, or you go to a restaurant and you have a crowded table with people. And at that table, the table and your experience at that table is actually better off with more people, right? As the people that you love and care about crowd around, you don't suffer as other people get added. Instead, you benefit. The idea of power, as we think about it now, is the assumption that if I have power, that means that you have less power. And if I gain power, that means that you have less power. And that is an incredibly white supremacist and sexist and misogynistic idea of power. And by buying into that, then we buy into the idea that in order for us to access power, somebody else has to be excluded from power. But instead, if we think about power as this idea of this crowded table, and as more people come to our table, our lives and experiences are actually made better, and that our collectively we grow, then we can think instead about the idea of power as not this finite resource that we all get to fight over, but instead a resource that grows as more people have access to it. Because feminist epistemology argues that who we are and our experiences shape the knowledge that we have, in its core, it then presents the idea that we need to have a more diverse group of people have access to power. It forces us as feminists to also consider that we don't know everything. And the people that tell us that they know everything don't actually know everything, because they haven't had universal experiences. Instead, what we want is a wide set of experiences represented in every room, in every place of power, because each of those people brings their own unique experiences to that room. So that feminist epistemology, that our viewpoints matter and shape the knowledge that we can possibly possess about the world, becomes very important. The sort of next thing that feminism offers to us is an idea of the question of sort of what is power, and how do we think about what power is. Feminism pushes us to recalibrate how we think about power. And this is one place where I think that white feminism has really fallen down on the job. So one of the ways that white feminists, in my mind, have betrayed the idea of feminism is that we have accepted that power is access to material resources. And so we look at something like access to a college education, right? We're all associated with the provision of college education. We care a lot about this. Starting around the year 1997, women started earning college degrees at higher rates than men, and this trend has continued. This is a trend that is particularly relevant and exacerbated among white people in the United States, with white women earning college degrees at far higher rates than white men. And those of you in college admissions or those of you that study anything associated with the demographics of college students know that this is true, right? So white women are getting into college at higher rates and they're finishing college at higher rates. And we as white women, as white feminists, have that like, yes, like we're winning, right? This is what we're talking about, of access to power. We're getting access to power. We're increasingly moving into the workforce. Look at these gains that white women have made in terms of access to economic power. This is such a lie, though, because we have traded off this idea of economic power as the only form of power that matters in exchange for actually trying to change systems. This also is a lie because when we think about something like access to the workforce, Black women and Latina women and Asian American women have been working this entire time. It's really just white women that re-entered the workforce starting in 1970, increasingly to today. We also see that many of the sort of big gains that women have made in terms of policies are concentrated among white women. So something like access to parental leave, almost 1 out of every 2 white women has some kind of access to paid parental leave. That's down to 1 out of 4 if we look at Hispanic women. Or if we look at something like COVID and the effects of COVID on people's economic situation. We learned a lot about how women were leaving the workforce at the beginning of COVID and haven't been re-entering at the same rate. But these effects are far more concentrated among Hispanic women and Black women than they are among white women, who have continuously been regaining the employment that they had pre-COVID. So when we think about this idea that for white feminists, access to power means economic resources, I don't want to dismiss economic resources as powerful. They are absolutely powerful, and anybody that has lived in poverty at any point in their life knows that economic resources are powerful. But at the same time, we have decided that all that we need is this, and that's going to change everything. When really what we need to do is think really systematically about the idea of power and think about alternative measures of power. So, for example, I personally really like the idea of power as not a power over, but instead a power to. Power as a capacity or ability to transform oneself or others. So in that circumstance, if we think about power not as the ability to force other people to do things, but instead the ability to empower ourselves or others, then something like access to a college education becomes really important, not because of just the economic gains that it grants us as white women, but also because of the opportunities that it gives us to empower ourselves and others. Again, we want to think about situationality as the core here, the idea of power as defined by individuals' lived experiences. And then finally, I want to think about feminism as an opportunity to think about changing the unequal distribution of power. And here, this is where I think feminists really have an advantage, because we think a lot about systems. And the idea of changing the unequal distribution of power requires that we think about systematic changes, not individual changes. And here we see this conflict, right, particularly among white women, of can we solve our problems just by individual responses? This, what I might refer to as like the lean in version of feminism. If we all just like work a little bit harder, then we're gonna solve these problems. But that's bullshit. Instead, what we want is an idea of changing the unequal distribution of power through systematic changes. I think a really interesting example here is the idea of policing. So policing itself is deeply misogynistic and racist. We see issues associated with domestic violence and sexual assault at far higher rates among the police population. Police do not protect women. For example, sexual assault is dramatically underreported in the United States. And even though we have this selection bias where only the most extreme cases get reported, the police only solve about 1 in 3 of those cases, which is the second lowest rate after robbery for foreclosure rates by police. The police do not protect us. And yet white women have bought into the idea that we are protected by the police. And so if we think about something like policing, where individual white women think about their own experiences in this very narrow way and think like, oh, well, I'm worried about the world and the police help me gain control of the world, that's not going to solve anything. Instead, what we need to think about is the opportunities for white feminists to engage in systematic reforms of our systems in order to make the world safer for everybody, not just those individuals that get to benefit from what we might call sort of the audacious innocence of white womanhood. So here, I really love Nadia's idea of her phrasing of when you center the folks at the margins, that really requires that you destroy boundaries. Feminism offers us some tools of how we might do that, the ways that we might think about changing what the boundaries are. For some of us, that might be offering a seat at our crowded table to additional people. That might mean pulling up a chair or going and getting a new chair, right? So thinking about an opportunity to squeeze more people in. It also might mean something like flipping the table, getting rid of the practices of power that we have. It might mean tearing down the house. It might mean building a new house that is more equitable, where we think about power as the opportunity to empower ourselves and others, rather than the power to force other people to do things. And I will end there. I'm very excited for your questions.
Thank you so much, Mirya. That was incredibly powerful. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie Hicks, to moderate the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Dr. Holman, this was awesome. We do have some questions. One of the things that I wanted to hit on, I've been making some notes as we've been going on. And Dr. Brown, one of the things you mentioned was the feminist movement has, in modern times, kind of forgotten about Black women and how we started this. How then can white women show up and actually, and one of the questions is, what are the specific ways that cisgendered, able-bodied white women can support intersectional feminist causes while both not dominating the space and not leaving the leadership solely responsible to marginalized individuals?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So I push back on like the framing of this question as like white women are on the outside. Like you need allies, and allies means that you're on the outside, not you're in there trying to work towards progress, right? So I would first push back on that, right? And so start thinking about ways that you can use your talents, your skills, your resources to advance a cause that is something that's being pushed forth by folks at the center. So it's like all get in here, use what you can. I don't know, but for everyone, right, that those things are different. Like Mirya talked about resources really explicitly, right, about like economic resources. And if you are a person that has some means and can write a check, perhaps that's the best thing that you could do at a particular time. But it's this, I just want us to dissolve ourselves of the notion that there isn't room for others, that this needs to be a movement that is still bifurcated, just putting women of color at the forefront, but instead think about, all right, how do all of us work together to change something, right? And recognize that we all have different privileges and marginalizations, but if we work together, we're much more powerful when we can use all of our talents, skills, and resources to the good, for something good.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful statement in that when you look at the modern feminist movement, we're seeing things like taking on a partner's last name and whether or not we have body hair, or how we best climb the professional ladder when a number of marginalized women are still dealing with things like fair housing and equal rights to education, maternal mortality rates, food deserts, just basic needs, right? And so how do you then point those women in the direction of motivationally moving forward as one when their issues are not necessarily being addressed?
Yes, I get that a lot.
This can be to Dr. Holman as well.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to talk on top of you.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I get this a lot from some students who feel that their privilege marginalizes them, right? Because if the issues that they care about, like body hair removal, wearing makeup, trying to, deciding how to fit into a heteronormative structure, whether it's taking a partner's last name or wanting to be married, right? So these are real issues, right, that concern folks, and I don't want to make them small or try to say that they don't matter, because there are issues that people are dealing with that are life or death, right? Do I have access to fair housing? Will I be evicted, right? We know that Black women are the face of evictions in this country, particularly before COVID and now even more so. Or, right, you mentioned Black maternal death and infant mortality rates. These are life and death issues. But those women who have recognized that they have privilege to be thinking about wearing nail polish might also think about ways that they can show up and for other women, right, who don't have a luxury right now of thinking about makeup or taking a partner's last name. So I don't want to see them as like an either or. And I also want to, put a call out there for folks who are dealing with real life or death on the ground feminist issues like housing inequality or food scarcity, is that there are people who are waiting to be called in, right? That there are folks out there who don't know that that's a feminist issue, and that we also need to be doing the hard work of calling out to them and making them understand that, yes, you care about feminist issues, and for you, maybe that looks like, what hair color should I have, if not any, right, to cover my grays or not. But you could be doing some good work over here too. And I think sometimes both sides get lost, right? Because right, other sides say, well, you're not liberal or progressive enough, right? We don't want you. There's no room for you here, without trying to make these linkages. So it is like this very basic understanding of that some of these feminist issues are life and death, but it's not to try to push people away by saying, you're not dealing with this. You don't understand my pain or my trauma. So we don't want you. We don't need you. You're dealing with these trivial, frivolous issues. And then others recognize, yeah, your issues are not life or death, right? But what ways can you take that same kind of feminist ethos to help out your sisters who are dealing with these issues?
I would also say, like, building directly off of what Nadia said, one of the tools that I try to encourage my students who have these same discussions, right? And I'm sure that the students at Northwestern are having these same discussions of, is to think about ways to, and this is a very academic term, but mainstream feminism and anti-racist work into all parts of their life, right? So thinking about the ways that we can reconceptualize something like the evictions epidemic in the United States as an explicit feminist and anti-racist issue, right? If we care about feminism and we care about anti-racism, then we need to care about this issue, and we need to think about feminist and anti-racist solutions to the issue. And getting students comfortable with that vocabulary of thinking about, yes, a feminist issue is whether or not you take your husband's last name, or whether you wear a wedding ring, or whether you get married at all. But a feminist issue also is access to food in this country and food insecurity. And if you have the vocabulary and the tools to think about this in one venue, then it's easier to pull those terms and those action items into other places. So centering the experiences of Black women within the evictions epidemic is really important, because the solutions are different if you talk to Black women experiencing evictions than if you talk to landlords trying to evict people. And so like these tools of the language and the frame of analysis can be useful for people navigating a wide set of concerns in their life.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This next question is really interesting in that one of the subject or content sessions for this series that we have been thinking about was titled The Intentional Ally. So thinking about white males and how they can be more present in this feminist movement. So one of the questions that we received is, how can we make or save space at the table for our allies, such as making men understand their value to feminism and understand their value to Black and other people of color feminism?
Yeah, so I don't want to be a broken record, right? But again, like, stop thinking about yourself as an ally. Get in here and do the work. But this is also, I think, really appropriate as we think about issues of sexual violence and harassment and misconduct. And often, women of color, queer folks are not seen as legitimate victims of these forms of biases and assault, and which enables people to commit these kind of behaviors with impunity, right? And so if a person is going to be an abuser, they might choose to pick on people that are seen. So, like, for example, right, happened in USC, what came out with the gynecologist last night, or and it's been coming out like before, it just came out last night that USC now has to pay $1 billion to settle this person's sexual abuses, but that he preyed on Asian women, right, who had sexual mores in their own culture that said they should wait until marriage, right? And so if they were seeking access to a birth control by coming to this gynecologist at USC, that he would prey on them. But who was silent in all of this, right, was the university administration, who were mostly white male. And so it's thinking about, even if you're not the ones who are committing these, right, if you're not doing sexual harassment, misconduct, and violence towards women, particularly women that are marginalized because of their gender identity or their race. But if you're at a seat at the table, right, if you have that power, right, if you're the person that kind of Mirya was talking about at the beginning, how might you be equipping these people to behave as bad actors continually? And I think, right, the conversation is, if you have privilege and if you are getting a seat at the table that allows you to have power, to exercise power, there are ways that you can stop and say no, right? There are ways that you don't have to pass the buck along. And oftentimes we think about these things as being passed along because the institution's failure, things that the academy hasn't done right, or things that hasn't gone right in politics, thinking about Andrew Cuomo. But these are all structures that are put in place by people. And oftentimes the people that have power to pass these things along, to do continued violence to those at the margins, are white men. And so I think, if thinking about calling in these allies, even if they're not there when the act is going down, right? I'm not talking about being a great bystander and saying, no, don't do this, right? Which you should. But if you hear about this secondhand or third hand, how do you act? How do you show up? And if you're silent, you're complicit. And usually you're complicit because you're part of the power structure. So recognize that. Own your power, own your privilege.
Can I interject just quickly, because I just want to push you, Nadia, to put a finer point on that, because I get this question a lot, right, as well. And so all of the examples that you've cited are kinds of examples of interrupting negative consequences for women. What can men, white, Black, Asian, all men need to do this work? What are some positive, concrete things that we can do? You know, who should we give money to? What organization? You know, like that's the level of conversation that I think we need to have. You know, so if both of you could think about, could respond to that, that'd be great. And then we take a couple more questions.
I was going to borrow a phrase from Mirya, don't be a jerk, right? She came on and said and took us in a very powerful way to our politics, groups, and identities workshop. It's like, don't be a bad actor. That's like level one, step one. Okay, so I'll let Mirya go, but I think some of the things are just so basic that you just want to remind folk of, like, be a decent human being. That is step one. Don't engage in behaviors that bully or intimidate or marginalize other folks. You have the control over that.
I think also, I think a lot about the power to behave in particular ways that men are granted that it's more difficult for women to have. So I think a really interesting example of this is that white men's anger is acceptable, and it's basically not acceptable from any other group. And so a really concrete thing that I look for from men in my department, in my life as allies, is to be angry on behalf of people that are being treated poorly, right? So you use your anger. You're the only one that can be angry. You're the only one whose anger is tolerated. So use it appropriately. Or like self-promotion is accepted from men and it's not as accepted from women. And so use your tool of being able to use your voice to uplift the experiences and successes of women and people of color in your life, right? So thinking about a very concrete thing of like bragging about cool things that women in your life have done to other men regularly. Like those types of small things that you have access to that we don't have access to can be very powerful ways to disrupt the idea of who gets to behave in specific ways.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you both. So I'm gonna try to squeeze in, I'm gonna make it one question, but it's really two, so I'm cramming. So firstly, the audience is asking for recommendations for intersectional feminist organizations to support. So if you, Dr. Holman, Dr. Brown, if you have any of those, drop them in the chat. We'll make sure that we get them out to the group that joined us here. But the question here is, how can we rethink power? There are limited spaces in C-suites, political offices, et cetera. Is there a certain kind of power that we should be putting a spotlight on? And is there a way that you can recommend we do so?
So first, to organizations that I think can always welcome people's donations, their resources, their time, their talents, are things that are often led by Indigenous folks on the ground. So look in your own community. I think so. Not necessarily extracting your money, your talents, and your resources outside of your community, but think about those that are on the ground that are doing this work. Also, as a person who studies elected officials, donating money to women of color in the primaries is a really, really big thing, right? Because oftentimes they don't make it out without the kind of the donations, the money that really would help them to move up into the general election. When thinking about power, I think about power as being transformative. What are you using your power to do, right? And so it's not necessarily a power over, but as Miriam pointed out, right, it's power to, right? And if you close your eyes, so I think reading Black feminist literature is so politically necessary because these writers have given us tools to reimagine what the world might look like. And so if we could think about a world in which Black women are centered, it's a liberatory practice, it's a transformative practice, and it's a different organization of how we think about power. And it's not a power of who gets to dominate someone else, but how inclusive can you be? And your power actually lies in diversity. Your power lies in helping other people. Your power lies in being more inclusive. And so when we reframe how we're thinking about our traditional notions of power, which really rest in very violent ways like coercion, domination, really trying to force people to do things that otherwise they would not do, you know, the flip side is one that gets us at liberatory, anti-racist, feminist, anti-sexist practices.
Wonderful. Thank
Totally echo what Nadia says about investing in your own community. A couple of organizations often that are led by women of color are domestic violence organizations in your community, always need resources. And when you're giving money, that really matters. I support mutual aid organizations in my community. I support organizations that are helping sex workers in my community, sort of thinking about the most marginalized members of our community and who's helping them. I also would really like to think about if we're sort of thinking about how we identify who's using power in the right ways. I think it's not just like, oh, what white guy out there like put a Black woman into the C-suite, right? Like, oh, look at that guy. Oh, that guy's doing it the right way, right? But it's not just that, right? It's also then, does he give that Black woman the power to do whatever the hell she wants when she's there, and give her the opportunity to then empower additional people, right? So it's not just, are you checking the diversity box in some way, but instead, are you changing the system that you have so that when you change who's at the table, those people then can further change the table, they can change the room, they can change the house. So thinking about not just appointment, but appointment with power.
Wonderful. And I think it's important for people to understand the different levels of power and how you show up and how your privilege might show up on those levels. And so I think in the 60s, it was Bertram Raven, maybe, yes, no. But it's something that I implore our audience to look into, just understanding the levels of power and where you kind of fall on those different levels. We have some homework and we have our next announced event. Dr. Holman, Dr. Brown, this has been the quickest hour that has gone. I could talk to you all for hours. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to our space and speaking to our population. I'm sure we are going to give many notes of thank you and gratitude.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Yes, thank you for having me. And Miriam, being in great conversation. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all so much. So now we're going to turn it over to our colleague, Steve Adams, who is going to talk about his homework. Steve gives a bit of homework on how to actually be an anti-racist at the end of every session. So he's going to come on and do that and then tell us a little bit about the next session. So Steve, we'll turn it over to you.
I'd like all of you in the audience to join me in reflecting on this idea that really hit me hard the other day. And the first part is, really, if you benefit from unearned privilege, and I do as an African-American man, you must know that someone developed theories and philosophies. Someone sat to figure out, how in the world can I approach, how can I say it, how can I choose just the right words to change this? Number one, some people unapologetically develop theories just for their own survival, right? And I think about these folks, right, who wrote But Some of Us Are Brave many, many years ago. Or when I think about Tracy Chapman and her song Behind the Wall, if you don't know it, go listen to some Tracy Chapman, talking about domestic violence. Someone is out there creating art and theory and philosophy that was, one, for their survival, but also it was meant, to maybe, just maybe, inspire you to listen, grow, and transform. I don't know. I just find it humbling to think and reflect on the notion that someone was trying to find the right way to say a thing, to create change within a domain where I benefit from the reason why they're struggling. They're coping to, they're figuring out how to survive this system of oppression, right? So if I, as a heterosexual man, benefit from certain kinds of privileges, I have to reflect on that. I don't want to go too long because I want to stay within time, but if we can go and find some of this theory. So I use, but some of us are brave as a good example here. You know, I'm, for the homework this time, go and find some theory that challenges the privileges you least want to deal with. Excuse that typo. You least want to deal, you want to deal with the least. And so, for example, white men, sit with some Black feminist theory. Heterosexual folks, go and sit with some queer theory. But ideally, we want to get to a place where folks don't have to create entire theories and philosophies in order to be heard when they say that they're hurting, in order to be heard when they say that they just want an equal chance, right? And so think for a moment about the kind of privileges you carry, and think about and go and pursue some information that will disrupt that potentially, and just sit with theory, sit with art. There's this new book called Black Futures. The notion that someone wrote a book I think you get what I'm saying about Black futures. Someone had to write a book about that. Anyway, that's the homework for this week. I'd like to thank you. And next week, the title of the session is Lessons from the Field, Real Conversation about Racial Equity Work in Cultural Institutions. Two good friends of mine from other institutions, Makiba Clay from the Phillips collection, and Kalinda Lee from the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. They're both amazing speakers, and they're sort of on the ground in the field doing racial equity work. And they have a lot to share, a lot of good lessons.